Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. A Loophole. Mr. Gradgrind walked homeward from the school in a state of considerable satisfaction. It was his school, and he intended it to be a model. He intended every child in it to be a model, just as the young Gradgrinds were all models. There were 5 young Gradgrinds, and they were models every one. They had been lectured at from their tenderest years, coursed like little hares. Almost as soon as they could run alone, they had been made to run to the lecture-room. The first object with which they had an association, or of which they had a remembrance, was a large blackboard with a dry ogre chalking ghastly white figures on it. Not that they knew, by name or nature, anything about an ogre. Fact forbid. I only use the word to express a monster in a lecturing castle, with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one, taking childhood captive, and dragging it into gloomy statistical dens by the hair. No little Gradgrind had ever seen a face in the moon. It was up in the moon before it could speak distinctly. No little Gradgrind had ever learnt the silly jingle, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." No little Gradgrind had ever known wonder on the subject. Each little Gradgrind having at 5 years old dissected the Great Bear like a Professor Owen, and driven Charles's Wain like a locomotive engine-driver. No little Gradgrind had ever associated a cow in a field with that famous cow with the crumpled horn, who tossed the dog, who worried the cat, who killed the rat, who ate the malt, or with that yet more famous cow who swallowed Tom Thumb. It had never heard of those celebrities, and had only been introduced to a cow as a graminivorous ruminating quadruped with several stomachs. To his matter-of-fact home, which was called Stone Lodge, Mr. Gradgrind directed his steps. He had virtually retired from the wholesale hardware trade before he built Stone Lodge, and was now looking about for a suitable opportunity of making an arithmetical figure in Parliament. Stone Lodge was sitting on a moor within a mile or 2 of a great town, called Coketown in the present faithful guide-book. A regular feature on the face of the country, Stone Lodge was, not the least disguise toned down or shaded off that uncompromising fact in the landscape. A great square house, with a heavy portico darkening the principal windows, as its master's heavy brows overshadowed his eyes. A calculated, cast-up, balanced, and proved house. 6 windows on this side of the door, 6 on that side. A total of 12 in this wing, a total of 12 in the other wing. 4 and 20 carried over to the back wings. A lawn and garden and an infant avenue, all ruled straight like a botanical account-book. Gas and ventilation, drainage and water service, all of the primest quality. Iron clamps and girders, fire-proof from top to bottom. Mechanical lifts for the housemaids, with all their brushes and brooms. Everything that heart could desire. Everything? Well, I suppose so. The little Gradgrinds had cabinets in various departments of science, too. They had a little conchological cabinet, and a little metallurgical cabinet, and a little mineralogical cabinet, and the specimens were all arranged and labelled, and the bits of stone and ore looked as though they might have been broken from the parent substances by those tremendously hard instruments, their own names. And, to paraphrase the idle legend of Peter Piper, who had never found his way into their nursery, if the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped at more than this, what was it, for good gracious goodness' sake, that the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped at. Their father walked on in a hopeful and satisfied frame of mind. He was an affectionate father, after his manner, but he probably would have described himself, if he had been put, like Sissy Jupe, upon a definition, as an eminently practical father. He had a particular pride in the phrase eminently practical, which was considered to have a special application to him. Whatsoever the public meeting held in Coketown, and whatsoever the subject of such meeting, some Coketowner was sure to seize the occasion of alluding to his eminently practical friend Gradgrind. This always pleased the eminently practical friend. He knew it to be his due, but his due was acceptable. He had reached the neutral ground upon the outskirts of the town, which was neither town nor country, and yet was either spoiled, when his ears were invaded by the sound of music. The clashing and banging band attached to the horse-riding establishment, which had there set up its rest in a wooden pavilion, was in full bray. A flag, floating from the summit of the temple, proclaimed to mankind that it was Sleary's horse-riding, which claimed their suffrages. Sleary himself, a stout modern statue with a money-box at his elbow, in an ecclesiastical niche of early Gothic architecture, took the money. Miss Josephine Sleary, as some very long and very narrow strips of printed bill announced, was then inaugurating the entertainments with her graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Among the other pleasing, but always strictly moral wonders, which must be seen to be believed, Signor Jupe was that afternoon to elucidate the diverting accomplishments of his highly trained performing dog Merrylegs. He was also to exhibit his astounding feat of throwing 7,500 hundredweight in rapid succession back-handed over his head, thus forming a fountain of solid iron in mid-air, a feat never before attempted in this or any other country, and which, having elicited some rapturous plaudits from enthusiastic throngs, it cannot be withdrawn. The same Signor Jupe was to enliven the varied performances at frequent intervals with his chaste Shakespearian quips and retorts. Lastly, he was to wind them up by appearing in his favourite character of Mr. William Button, of Tooley Street, in the highly novel and laughable hippocomedietta of the Tailor's Journey to Brentford. Thomas Gradgrind took no heed of these trivialities, of course, but passed on as a practical man ought to pass on, either brushing the noisy insects from his thoughts, or consigning them to the house of correction. But the turning of the road took him by the back of the booth, and at the back of the booth a number of children were congregated, in a number of stealthy attitudes, striving to peep in at the hidden glories of the place. This brought him to a stop.
"Now to think of these vagabonds,"
said he,
"attracting the young rabble from a model school."
A space of stunted grass and dry rubbish being between him and the young rabble, he took his eye-glass out of his waistcoat to look for any child he knew by name, and might order off. Phenomenon almost incredible, though distinctly seen, what did he then behold but his own metallurgical Louisa, peeping with all her might through a hole in a deal-board, and his own mathematical Thomas abasing himself on the ground to catch but a hoof of the graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Dumb with amazement, Mr. Gradgrind crossed to the spot where his family was thus disgraced, laid his hand upon each erring child, and said,
"Louisa! Thomas!"
Both rose, red and disconcerted. But Louisa looked at her father with more boldness than Thomas did. Indeed, Thomas did not look at him, but gave himself up to be taken home like a machine.
"In the name of wonder, idleness, and folly,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, leading each way by a hand,
"what do you do here?"
"Wanted to see what it was like."
returned Louisa, shortly.
"What it was like?"
"Yes, father."
There was an air of jaded sullenness in them both, and particularly in the girl. Yet, struggling through the dissatisfaction of her face, there was a light with nothing to rest upon, a fire with nothing to burn, a starved imagination keeping life in itself somehow, which brightened its expression, not with the brightness natural to cheerful youth, but with uncertain, eager, doubtful flashes, analogous to the changes on a blind face groping its way. She was a child now of 15 or 16, but at no distant day would seem to become a woman all at once. Her father thought so as he looked at her. She was pretty, would have been self-willed, he thought in his eminently practical way, but for her bringing up.
"Thomas, though I have the fact before me, I find it difficult to believe you, with your education and resources, should have brought your sister to a scene like this."
"I brought him, father,"
said Louisa quickly.
"I asked him to come."
"I am sorry to hear it. I am very sorry indeed to hear it. It makes Thomas no better than it makes you worse, Louisa."
She looked at her father again, but no tear fell down her cheek.
"You, Thomas, and you, to whom the circle of the sciences is open. Thomas, and you, who may be said to be replete with facts. Thomas, and you, who have been trained to mathematical exactness. Thomas, and you, here,"
cried Mr. Gradgrind,
"in this degraded position. I am amazed."
"I was tired, father. I have been tired a long time,"
said Louisa.
"Tired? Of what?"
asked the astonished father.
"I don't know of what. Of everything, I think."
"Say not another word,"
returned Mr. Gradgrind.
"You are childish. I will hear no more."
He did not speak again until they had walked some half a mile in silence, when he gravely broke out with,
"What would your best friends say, Louisa? Do you attach no value to their good opinion? What would Mr. Bounderby say?"
At the mention of this name his daughter stole a look at him remarkable for its intense and searching character. He saw nothing of it, for before he looked at her she had again cast down her eyes.
"What,"
he repeated presently,
"would Mr. Bounderby say?"
All the way to Stone Lodge, as with grave indignation he led the two delinquents home, he repeated at intervals,
"What would Mr. Bounderby say?"
as if Mr. Bounderby had been Mrs. Grundy. Chapter 3